Here is what Bridget would tell you, if she were being honest. The night she should have run was the night she didn't run. The night three men cornered her in a parking garage in Itaewon over a flash drive that could have dismantled a billion-dollar laundering empire, and instead of doing the reasonable thing, screaming, fleeing, begging, she stood completely still and did mental math. Here is the other thing she would tell you, if you asked the right way. The man who stepped out of that black Genesis was not her rescue. He was the beginning of a much larger, much more complicated problem. His name was Chul-Moo Nam. And Bridget, God help her, had already memorized the shape of every tattoo on his neck. Bridget was in the middle of mentally reconstructing a fraudulent ledger trail, 5 ghost subsidiaries, 3 shell accounts, 1 beautifully disguised Cayman routing number, when she felt it. That particular pressure. Not danger, exactly. Something older than danger. The sensation of being watched by someone who had already memorized your exits before you thought to look for them. She was in the underground parking structure beneath the Itaewon Tower, keys in her hand, encrypted flash drive pressed flat against the inside of her wrist where no one could see it. 3 men materialized from the concrete dark like they had been poured into it and were now stepping out. Their eyes were on her bag. Their hands were not empty. Give us the drive. The tallest one didn't phrase it as a question. Bridget didn't run. Running, she had learned, was a confession. She stood perfectly still and calculated the distance to the stairwell. 17 feet. Not viable. She recalculated. Then the atmosphere changed. Not loudly. That was the thing that would stay with her longest, how quiet it was. A black Genesis eased to a stop at the garage entrance, unhurried, the headlights cutting long shadows across the concrete. A door opened. A man stepped out. He didn't draw a weapon. He adjusted his cuffs. The dark Hangul script tattooed along the column of his neck caught the light from the flickering fluorescent overhead. His forearms were marked too, ink disappearing into the rolled sleeve of his black shirt. He didn't look at the 3 men immediately. He looked at her first. Like he was finishing a thought. Then he turned his gaze on them, and the temperature in the garage seemed to physically drop. All 3 men left. Not quickly, instantly. Like the concept of staying had simply ceased to be available to them. Chul-Moo Nam crossed the space between them without any particular rush, his shoes almost silent on the oil-stained concrete. He stopped close. Too close. His jaw was sharp in the half-light. His eyes were darker than they had any right to be, and they didn't blink. He didn't ask if she was okay. "You only run," he said softly, his voice barely above a murmur, "when I tell you to run." Bridget stared at him. Her pulse was doing something embarrassing. "I wasn't running." "No," he said. He looked almost amused, in the way a closed door looks almost open. "You were calculating." He glanced once at the spot where the 3 men had been. 17 feet to the stairwell. Not viable. He looked back at her. "I know how you think." She didn't know whether to be impressed or furious that he was right. And that was the moment she should have left. If you're already drawn into Bridget and Chul-Moo's story, take a second and hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow. And if you love intelligent, slow-burn Mafia drama like this, make sure you subscribe, because this is only the beginning of something far more dangerous. Tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it in your country right now? Now, let's continue. That was the first problem with Chul-Moo Nam. He was always right about her, which meant she was always slightly off balance around him, which meant the careful, ordered life she had rebuilt for herself and soul, the one governed by logic and quarterly audits and absolutely no irrational attachments, was under a kind of threat that no encrypted flash drive could protect against. She finally looked at him. A mistake she kept making over and over because she never seemed to learn the cost of it. Chul-Moo stood in front of her in a black shirt that did nothing to obscure the quiet authority of a man who had never in his life questioned whether he belonged in a room. Sharp jaw. Neck tattoos she knew the shape of now without meaning to. A stillness about him that wasn't peace, it was something more like a city the night before a verdict. His dark eyes were watching her with that particular focus she had come to recognize. The focus of someone who finds you genuinely interesting, which in his world was far more dangerous than being found beautiful. This was not her world. She needed to remember that. The underground garage glittered with nothing, no chandeliers, no string quartets, no old money in silk. Just concrete and sodium light, and a man who ran half the criminal underground of South Korea looking at her like she was the most coherent thing he'd seen all day. Bridget Nicholas was a forensic accountant from Baltimore who had come to Seoul 3 years ago to disappear quietly into spreadsheets and rebuild something that resembled a stable life. She was not supposed to be here. Not in a parking garage at midnight. Not within arm's reach of a mafia boss. Not standing still when everything in her training told her to create distance. But she was. She kept being here. Because somewhere between the first time he walked into her office in Uedo with no appointment and an expression like he was granting her an audience, and every careful, charged, deliberately uncrossed line since, the distance had quietly stopped being the point. That had started 6 months ago. And it had started, as most disasters do, with numbers. It had started, as most disasters do, with numbers. 6 months earlier, Bridget had been 3 weeks into a routine forensic audit for a mid-tier Seoul conglomerate when she found the first anomaly. A single routing entry, 0.003% variance in a quarterly disbursement ledger. Most auditors would have rounded it off and moved on. Bridget pulled the thread. By the end of the week, she had 5 ghost subsidiaries mapped across her second monitor, each one feeding into the next like a set of nested dolls. By the end of the second week, she had a name. Biko. She should have closed the file. She knew that. She had sat in her Uedo office on the 31st floor, the Han River a gray ribbon below her, and she had given herself exactly 4 minutes to decide what kind of person she was going to be. Then she printed the documentation, locked it in her personal safe, and went home. He came to her office 3 days later. No appointment. No entourage. Just Chul-Moo Nam in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly retainer, standing in her doorway like the concept of knocking had simply never occurred to him. His neck tattoos were visible above his collar, dark Hangul script she hadn't learned to read yet. His eyes moved across the room in under 2 seconds, cataloging everything. Then they landed on her and stopped. "Ms. Nicholas," he said. Bridget had looked up from her screen, noted who he was, noted the 2 men she could see standing in the hallway behind him, and made a decision. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "I've been expecting someone," she said. "Sit down." He did. Which, she would later learn, was unusual. He had come to retrieve the documentation. What he didn't expect, what visibly recalibrated something behind those dark eyes, was that she had already prepared a second copy and filed it with a third party she declined to name, under instructions to release it automatically if she stopped checking in every 48 hours. She explained this calmly, without raising her voice, without breaking eye contact. Chul-Moo had studied her for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he smiled. The dinner had been his idea. A private room at a restaurant in Mapo, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Han, the kind of place that didn't post a menu because the guests didn't require one. He had ordered for both of them in rapid Korean, then turned his attention entirely to her, which was, she was discovering, the most disorienting thing about him, the totality of his focus. They talked about the files. Technically. But the subtext moved underneath the conversation like a current, slow and certain. "You weren't afraid," he said at one point, refilling her glass without asking. "I was," Bridget said. "I just didn't see how showing it would help me." Chul-Moo looked at her the way she imagined he looked at very few things, like she was a problem he found genuinely worth solving. "No," he said quietly. "You weren't." She wore burgundy. Not because he asked her to. Because she had stood in front of her closet for 11 minutes, an embarrassing amount of time for a woman who prided herself on decisive thinking, and burgundy was the color that felt like armor. A floor-length silk gown, one shoulder bare, her natural hair pinned up with 2 loose coils at her jaw. She looked, she decided, like someone who belonged wherever she chose to stand. She repeated that to herself in the car. The casino had no sign. No street-level entrance a civilian would recognize. Just a Gangnam address, a freight elevator that opened into something that looked like the inside of a very expensive fever dream, low amber lighting, black lacquered walls. The sound of chips and low conversation layered beneath a live quartet playing something cool and European in the corner. The air smelled like aged whiskey and discretion. Chul-Moo had been waiting at the bottom of the elevator. He looked at her the way he sometimes did, a single, unhurried sweep, top to bottom, then back to her face and said nothing, which somehow communicated more than a sentence would have. "You came," was all he said. "You asked," was all she answered. He kept his hand at the small of her back for most of the evening. It was not possessive, exactly. It was more like a perimeter, a quiet, physical declaration that required no words. She noticed the way conversations shifted when they approached. The way men who had been looking at her suddenly found somewhere else to look. The way women tracked Chul-Moo with a particular wariness that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with survival instinct. This was his world. She was walking through it wearing burgundy silk, balancing a glass of something she wasn't drinking, telling herself she was here professionally, observationally. Thus she was gathering information. His thumb moved once, absently, against her lower back. She took a sip of her drink. She was mid-sentence, something about the casino's incorporation structure, which she had recognized immediately as a layering vehicle, when the first shot broke the room open. Not a pop. A crack. Then another. Then the sound of glass giving way all at once, and the careful architecture of the evening collapsed into chaos. Chul-Moo moved before she processed what was happening. His arm came across her chest like a door slamming shut, and then she was moving, not running, being moved, tucked hard behind the mahogany bar as the room erupted around them. Screaming. Overturned tables. The quartet gone silent mid-note. He pressed her flat against the bar's inner panel, his body angled in front of hers, one hand firm on her shoulder. His face, inches from hers, was completely calm. That was the moment she understood, in a way she hadn't fully before, that the stillness she had mistaken for composure was something else entirely. It was practice. The firefight lasted 90 seconds. Bridget knew this because she counted. It was the only thing she could control. The numbers, the seconds, the measurable architecture of a situation that had stopped being measurable the moment the first shot landed. She pressed her back against the bar and counted, and listened to Chul-Moo's enforcers move through the room with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this before and would do it again, and did not find either fact remarkable. 90 seconds. Then near silence. Broken glass. Someone moaning on the far side of the room. The quartet's cello knocked on its side, resonating with the vibration of the floor. Chul-Moo rose first, slow and unhurried, and surveyed the room with the expression of a man checking a weather report. Bridget started to stand. That was when the lieutenant came from the left. He was young, that was the detail that stayed with her. Younger than she expected. He came around the far end of the bar with a gun leveled and desperation written across every line of his face, the particular desperation of someone who has already made a decision they can't walk back. He made it 2 steps. Chul-Moo disarmed him in a single, fluid motion, wrist, elbow, redirection, so clean and practiced it looked choreographed. The gun skittered across the floor. The lieutenant hit the wall. Bridget watched from where she was still half-crouched, her hand braced on the bar's edge. What happened next took 4 seconds. She had replayed it many times since, trying to find the moment she could have looked away. There wasn't one. Chul-Moo's face didn't change. That was the part that hollowed her out completely, not the act itself, but the absence of anything surrounding it. No anger. No hesitation. No acknowledgement that a line was being crossed, because for him, she understood now, there was no line. There was only before and after, and he moved between them like a man stepping through a door. For seconds. Then stillness. He straightened his cuffs. He turned to look at her. There was blood on his collar. A small amount. Geometrically precise, the way these things sometimes were. Bridget looked at him, at the Hangul tattoos on his neck, at the dark eyes she had spent 6 months telling herself were complicated, layered, worth understanding, and felt something she had carefully constructed dissolve completely. She had built a version of him that could coexist with her life. Dangerous, yes. Morally compromised, certainly. But knowable. Containable. A man operating in darkness who had, perhaps, chosen her as something adjacent to light. She saw now that she had authored that version entirely herself. He said her name. She nodded. She let him guide her out. She did not speak in the car. The next morning, she was gone before the city woke up. One bag. Laptop. The encrypted drive. She stood over her phone for exactly 3 seconds before dropping it into the kitchen drawer and walking out without it. In the elevator, she rolled her backup SIM between her fingers, then crushed it against the metal railing. The version of her that might have stayed, she left her too, somewhere between the 41st floor and the lobby. She did not look back. The apartment in Hanam-dong had 3 things going for it. A reinforced door with a deadbolt she had replaced herself within an hour of getting the keys. A landlord who accepted cash and asked no questions. And a position on the building's east side that gave her a sight line to the street below without putting her in direct view of it. She had found it the way she found most things, methodically, without leaving a traceable pattern. Cash withdrawals spread across 4 different ATMs over 2 weeks prior, back when she'd first started to understand that knowing Chul-Moo Nam had an expiration date she couldn't yet calculate. She had prepared the exit before she knew she'd need it, because that was what Bridget Nicholas did. She planned for the version of events she hoped wouldn't happen. She moved in at 5 a.m. with 1 bag and no forwarding address. By day 3, she had her monitors set up and was back inside a client's ledger, which was the closest thing she had to sedation. Numbers were honest. They didn't have faces. They didn't adjust their cuffs after doing something that rearranged your understanding of what a person was capable of. A column either balanced or it didn't, and if it didn't, the answer was somewhere in the data, findable, retrievable, subject to logic. She worked 14-hour days and slept poorly and told herself this was fine. It was not fine. Every siren on the Hanam Bridge made her hand go still above the keyboard. Every set of footsteps in the hallway outside her door required 30 seconds of controlled breathing before she could resume. She had mapped every exit in the building on day 1, and she mentally rewalked them each morning while the coffee brewed, a ritual she recognized as irrational and performed anyway. She stopped sitting with her back to the window. She started sitting with her back to the wall. She did not let herself think about the blood on his collar. She thought about it constantly. The silence from the syndicate was the thing she hadn't anticipated. No one came. No black Genesis on the street below. No unfamiliar faces in the convenience store she used twice a week, timing her visits to off-peak hours. The building's front entrance stayed unremarkable. The city moved around her the way cities do, indifferently, continuously, and the Biko said nothing. By day 6, she was confused. By day 10, she was unsettled in a way that felt uncomfortably close to disappointed, which made no sense and which she refused to examine. By day 13, she was sitting at her desk at 2 in the morning, a cold cup of tea at her elbow, staring at a ledger she hadn't touched in an hour. She wondered if she had overestimated her own significance. If she had been, in the end, a passing fascination for a man who had many of them and forgot them all with equal ease. The thought sat in her chest like a stone she hadn't asked to carry. She pulled the ledger back up. She did not sleep. Day 14 arrived the way bad things often did, quietly, and then all at once. The monsoon had been building since morning, the kind of soul storm that didn't announce itself so much as simply take over, turning the city gray and loud and relentless by early afternoon. By nightfall, the rain was nearly horizontal, streaking down the tall glass panels of her living room in long, distorted rivers, the city lights below bleeding into each other like wet ink. Bridget stood at the glass in a red tank top and dark pants, bare feet on cold hardwood, and watched it. She had stopped pretending to work 2 hours ago. She was thinking about Baltimore. About the particular version of herself she had left there, younger, less careful, more easily broken. And whether the woman standing in this apartment in the dark was actually an improvement or just a more sophisticated construction of the same fundamental problem. She was thinking about 14 days of silence and what it meant and what she was going to do with the answer. She was not thinking about him. Then the shadows on the far side of the room shifted, and she understood 2 things simultaneously: that her security had been bypassed without a sound, and that there was only one person in Seoul capable of doing it. She didn't scream. She turned. Chul-Moo stood just inside the room, soaking wet, his black button-down shirt pressed flat against his chest by the weight of the rain, the polished armor of the Mafia boss entirely dissolved. Water ran from his jaw, tracing the dark lines of the Hangul tattoos on his neck, dripping from the hem of his sleeves. He looked like he had walked through the storm rather than driven through it, which she suspected was not far from the truth. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man at the absolute end of something. "You need to leave," Bridget said. He crossed the room in 3 strides, and she stepped back instinctively, her shoulders meeting the cold glass. He stopped close, too close, and she put both hands against his chest, a boundary and a contradiction, because her palms registered the hard, rapid knock of his heartbeat through the soaked fabric, and her body filed that information somewhere she couldn't immediately reach to delete it. "You don't get to just appear," she started. "I know. You don't get to bypass my security and stand in my apartment like I owe you an audience." "I know," he said again. Lower. "I am not a possession." Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I am not something you put down and pick back up when it's convenient." "I watched you," she stopped. Breathed. "I watched you, Chul-Moo, and I cannot unknow what I saw. You don't get to be angry that I left. You don't get to come here and—" "I'm not angry." The quietness of it stopped her. She looked at him. His jaw was tight. His eyes, usually so controlled, so unreadable, were burning with something that had clearly been building for 14 days and had run entirely out of containment. "I stayed away," he said carefully, like each word was being lifted from somewhere it had been compressed for a long time, "because coming to you meant leading them to you. The faction that hit the casino, they were watching for exactly that. Every day I didn't come here was a day I was dismantling their infrastructure so that when I finally did," he stopped. Something moved across his face. "You would still be here." Bridget stared at him. "I spent 14 days," he continued, his voice dropping further, the authority in it fracturing almost imperceptibly at the edges, "making sure no one on this earth had the means or the reason to touch you. I took apart everything they built. I removed every crosshair that had your name on it." His eyes didn't leave hers. "That is where I was." The rain hammered the glass behind her shoulders. She felt her hands, still pressed against his chest, register the way his breathing had changed, no longer measured, no longer the practiced calm of a man who had never needed to explain himself to anyone. "I miss you," he said. Just that. 3 words, stripped entirely of the terrifying authority she had come to associate with his voice, cracked open by something that sounded unavoidably like the truth. Bridget closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then the distance between them ceased to exist. The kiss was not gentle. It was the kind that happens when 2 people have been holding a door shut together for a very long time and finally, simultaneously, let go. His hand came up to the side of her face, rain-cold fingers against warm skin, and she gripped the wet fabric of his shirt, and the storm outside did what storms do, raged on, indifferent and absolute, while inside. Every careful boundary Bridget Nicholas had constructed over 6 months of deliberate, self-protective distance collapsed quietly into the dark. Morning arrived gray and exhausted, the way Seoul always looked after a monsoon, washed clean of pretense, every surface honest in the flat early light. Bridget woke first. Chul-Moo was sitting at the narrow kitchen table, already dressed, jacket on, posture fully restored. He had found her coffee and made it without asking how she took it, which meant he already knew, which meant she had been observed more carefully and for longer than she had accounted for. She filed that away and said nothing about it. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. The man who had stood soaking wet in her living room with his voice cracked open, that man had been folded back into the architecture of Chul-Moo Nam, syndicate boss, apex predator, controlled surface. He was composed and unreadable and immaculately buttoned. But he watched her cross the kitchen with an attention that was different from before. Quieter. More settled. The kind of attention that had stopped performing indifference because it no longer saw the point. She poured her coffee and sat across from him, and they existed in the same silence for a few minutes, which felt, strangely, like the most honest thing they had ever done together. His phone disrupted it at 7:30. Not a ring, a single pulse of vibration, a specific pattern she noticed him register with an immediate, subtle shift in posture. He glanced at the screen. Something behind his eyes went very still in the particular way that meant the information was serious, and he was already 3 steps into processing it. He took the call in Korean, low and brief. Under 2 minutes. When he set the phone down, his jaw was tight. The purge had a survivor, he said. No preamble. Yoon Dae-young. Mid-level, but resourceful. He's regrouped faster than anticipated. A pause. He is Kang. Kang, his head lieutenant. The one she had seen at his right hand at every meeting, every negotiation, every carefully orchestrated dinner that was never actually about dinner. A trap, Bridget said. Port of Incheon. Industrial yard on the south end. He stood, buttoning his jacket. I need you to stay here. The building security has been reset. My people are posted on the lower 2 floors. You'll be. No. He stopped. Bridget set down her coffee cup and looked at him with the particular steadiness she had developed over years of sitting across from men who expected her to accept the boundaries they drew. Yoon Dae-young ran his operation through 3 offshore holding structures I mapped 8 weeks ago. I know exactly where his liquid assets are, how his bribe network is funded, and which payments are keeping which officials cooperative. She reached across the table and picked up her encrypted tablet. You need me there. Chul-Moo studied her for a long moment. She watched him calculate risk against advantage, protection against capability, the same cold arithmetic she suspected he applied to everything. Stay close, he said finally. Bridget was already pulling on her jacket. The port of Incheon at midnight looked like the end of the world rendered in neon. Container stacks rose 30 feet on either side of the yard, rusted and indifferent. Puddles on the cracked concrete caught the red and green signal lights from the water and held them, trembling. The rain had tapered to a mist that didn't fall so much as simply exist, cold and directionless, coating every surface in a thin, reflective sheen. Bridget sat in the back of the second vehicle, tablet open across her knees, and watched Chul-Moo walk into the trap. He knew it was a trap. That was the thing. He walked in anyway, because Kang was zip-tied to a support column 40 meters inside the yard, and Chul-Moo Nam did not leave his people behind. She had come to understand this about him, that beneath the cold arithmetic of his authority was a loyalty so absolute it was almost its own kind of violence. Yoon Dae-young emerged from behind a shipping container with 11 men fanned out on either side of him, and the particular energy of someone who had spent 2 weeks losing and believed he had finally engineered a reversal. He hadn't accounted for her. The standoff crystallized fast. Chul-Moo's crew was outnumbered and outpositioned, hemmed in on 3 sides. Yoon spoke at length. She couldn't hear it clearly from the vehicle, but she could read the geometry of the situation without sound. The guns hadn't moved. Nobody had fired. Then Yoon turned and pointed directly at the vehicle she was sitting in. Chul-Moo went very still. Bridget did not waste the moment. She was already inside Yoon's primary offshore structure, a Cayman-registered holding entity she had mapped 2 months ago, feeding into a chain of 4 sequential accounts across 3 jurisdictions. Her fingers moved across the tablet with the focused economy of someone performing a task they have rehearsed, which she had, mentally, every day for 2 weeks without knowing she was doing it. Account 1, frozen. Account 2, frozen. She rerouted the third, the one funding Yoon's network of cooperative officials, into a suspended escrow that would take a team of international lawyers 6 months to untangle. She hit the fourth with a full drain, automated and irreversible, executed in the time it took Yoon's man to take 3 steps toward her vehicle. Her tablet confirmed, transaction complete. Somewhere across the city, 11 officials lost their incentive to stay cooperative simultaneously. She pulled up the dock's electrical management system. It had taken her 40 minutes on the drive over to find the access point, and located the breaker grid for the south yard. She looked at Chul-Moo across the wet concrete. 40 meters of cold air and loaded weapons between them. She triggered the blackout. 3 seconds of absolute dark. She counted them. On 2 she heard movement, fast, precise, the sound of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. On 3, a single sound she didn't let herself categorize. Then the lights came back. Yoon Dae-young was no longer standing. Chul-Moo was. He turned slowly and found her through the vehicle's windshield across the yard, his eyes locating her with the same immediate, unhurried certainty as the night in the parking garage, like finding her was simply something his eyes did automatically, without instruction. The Empire's loose ends had been severed. Not with a gun. With a ledger. Bridget closed her tablet and allowed herself, quietly and without ceremony, to exhale. The yard settled the way battlefields do, not with peace, but with the particular, heavy quiet that follows the removal of a threat. Chul-Moo's enforcers moved through the aftermath with practiced efficiency, speaking in low Korean, securing the perimeter, cutting Kong loose from the support column. Someone killed the emergency alarm. The neon signal lights from the water kept their indifferent rhythm, red and green washing across the wet concrete in slow, repeating intervals. Bridget stepped out of the vehicle. The mist had thinned. The air smelled like salt and diesel and the particular coldness that comes off deep water at night. She stood at the edge of the yard with her tablet tucked under one arm and catalogued the scene the way she catalogued everything, methodically, starting at the edges and working inward. The rival faction was gone. Not retreated. Gone. Physically dismantled by the man currently speaking quietly to his lieutenant across the yard. Financially dismantled by the woman standing at the perimeter in a jacket that was not designed for industrial dockyards, her forensic accounting software still warm from the most consequential audit of her career. She thought about the routing numbers. The frozen accounts. The cascade of automated transactions she had executed in under 4 minutes, while 11 guns were pointed at the vehicle around her. She had not been afraid. That was the thing she was still processing. She had been focused. Chul-Moo crossed the yard toward her. His enforcers watched without appearing to watch, that particular peripheral attention she had noticed in his men before, the awareness of their boss's movements as a form of professional orientation. The yard was still technically active, the cleanup still ongoing, and none of that registered on his face as relevant. He stopped in front of her. For a moment he simply looked at her, the way he had in the parking garage 9 months ago, that complete, unhurried attention that had unsettled her then and no longer did, because she understood now that it wasn't calculation. It was recognition. He reached down and took her hand. Then he removed the ring. She had noticed it before, heavy gold, a raised seal she had never examined closely, worn on his right hand with the ease of something that had been there so long it had stopped being an accessory and become simply part of him. The Biko family signet. She understood its weight in his world the way she understood financial instruments, precisely, without romanticism. He placed it on her finger. Around them, every enforcer in the yard went still. Chul-Moo didn't announce it. He didn't speak at all. He simply held her hand with the ring on it and looked at her, and the declaration moved through the assembled men like a current, wordless, absolute, and permanent. Bridget looked down at the ring, then up at him. "You could have asked," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "Would you have said yes?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved: the ledger, the parking garage, the monsoon, the 3 seconds of darkness at the port of Incheon. The 14 days of silence that had been, she now understood, the most violent act of protection she had ever witnessed. Eventually, she said. He almost smiled. For Chul-Moo Nam, it was practically effusive. They walked out of the yard together, past the containers and the signal lights and the men who would carry word of this night to every corner of Seoul's underworld before morning. Not a forensic accountant and a syndicate boss. Not a woman adjacent to a dangerous world, always one step outside it. 2 people who had each, in their own way, been the most dangerous thing in that yard tonight. Equals. At last. And that is how Bridget Nicholas stopped being adjacent to power. And became untouchable. If you made it all the way to the end, truly thank you. Your time means something, and I appreciate you spending it here. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves intelligent, character-driven mafia drama. And before you go, tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now in your country? I read every single one. Until the next story.